In this lesson, we're going to talk about means and weighted averages. For our first example, we want to see how means work when you have a variable in it. Suppose on 4 of your 5 biology tests, you scored a 90, a 95, a 97, and another 90. And then, if you want to exempt the final, you need to have a mean on the 5 tests that's greater than or equal to an 85. We want to know, what score do you have to make on your last test in order to exempt the final? So we want to know what score will give you an average of 85 when you get that score. Let's calculate the mean. The mean would be 90 plus 95 plus 97 plus 90 plus some other score, the score on your 5th test. We don't know the score, and as a matter of fact, that's what we're trying to find. Let's replace that with a variable. And we'll divide by 5 to complete the mean. We want this to be greater than or equal to 85. Now I didn't put greater than or equal to, I'm just putting equality. Whatever score we get for x, it will be at least that score will give us our answer. Now, to solve this equation, let's multiply both sides by 5. And then I'll go ahead and add up the numbers to get 372 is the sum of these 4 numbers, plus x is equal to, and 85 times 5 is 425. Now let's subtract the 372 from both sides. And we arrive at x is equal to 53. So to answer the question, you will exempt the final with a 53 or higher. That is, if you make a 53 on your 5th test, your average will be an 85, and then you will be able to exempt the final. You'll notice this is pretty far from a good score compared to the ones that you had before. But if you have that many scores above 85, you really don't have to do that well on the 5th test. Don't use this in practice, though. This is the kind of stuff where you might miss the mark if you're not too careful. Now let's talk about weighted averages. A weighted average is very common, and one of the places where you see it all the time is in your college courses. And possibly in high school this was done as well. That your weights are various percentages associated with what portion of your grade you want that particular type of assignment to be. Let's look at a particular class with the weights of 10% homework, 50% tests, 20% quizzes, and 20% on the final exam. And then you've got a few scores given to you of an 85 homework average, a 68 test average, a 75 quiz average, and a 63 on the final exam. We want to know, did you pass the class with a C? And we'll just assume a C is a 70 in this case. Now we don't have any formula for this, so I'm going to show you a new formula, and then we'll write it down formally later. What you do is you take the grade for that category. You might need to average to get this grade first. It has to be one grade for the whole category, and multiply that by the weight for that homework. Then you've got 68. Again, that's a test average for 50% of your grade. 75 is 20% of your grade. And then 63 is worth 20% of your grade. So take each category grade times the associated weight, and we will add these together. This will give us our actual average in the class. I get a total score of 70.1. So did we pass the class with a C? Yes, we have a pass. You'll notice that the student didn't have the best test average or the best final exam score, but because they did their homework and they were keeping up with the homework enough to do okay on the quizzes, they ended up passing the class even though their test scores weren't perfect. Here's the official formula for a weighted average. It's kind of odd, and I'll explain what's going on with this denominator. It's not always necessary. What you'll do is you'll multiply weights times grades, plus the next weight times the next grade, plus the next weight times the next grade, and do that until you've gone through every grade category, keeping in mind that the grades must be an average in that category. If you have more than one grade, you will average those together before you multiply that by the weight. This is a common mistake that students will make, is just they'll use the weight multiple times. Find the average, then you'll just do the weight times the grade. Now, I didn't use a denominator in my last example. This down here is dividing by the sum of the weights that you have so far. With that said, you can calculate an average before you know all the grades. This is a very common practice. You normally know what your grade is before you take the final exam, right? That's because it's possible to calculate a weighted average before all the weights have been used. And the way to do that is to divide by the sum of the weights that you have at the moment. Now, if you do have all of the data, then the sum of the weights will be 100% of your grade, and dividing by 1 doesn't do anything. So you only need to divide by the sum of the weights when you are missing data. Now let's do an example of what this looks like. Here we have the same weighting scheme of 10% homework, 50% test, 20% quiz, and 20% final exam. Now let's take a look at the various scores here. You'll notice that we have a homework average, a test average, and a quiz average, but we don't have a final exam. How do we deal with that? Well, again, take the grade times the weight plus the next grade times the next weight. Make sure that they match up with each other. 65 was tests, 50% was tests, times the next grade times the next weight. Now, I do not have a final exam score, so I'm not going to put anything with the 20% final exam, but what I am going to do is divide by the weights that I used, the 0.10, the 0.50, and the 0.20. So what we're basically saying here is this grade is out of 80% because we're missing the final exam. It hasn't been taken yet. And you'll notice, by the way, that these three numbers add to 80%. When I add up on top, I get 54.5. And based on what I'm going to ask in a moment, I strongly advise that you always write down this top number and don't do it all without writing down any steps. The bottom number I'll just write as 0.8, and then when we divide, we'll have a grade. I get that the current grade is a 68.125 in the class. So at the moment, the student is not passing, but if they do decent on the final, they should be able to pass. That leads to our follow-up question. What did we need to make on the final to make a C in the class? Now we'll do this problem a little bit differently. We're going to be doing the same thing of the grade times the weight, plus the next grade times the next weight, plus the next grade times the next weight. But now we want to add in the final exam as a variable, kind of like what we did in the first example with an ordinary mean. The final grade is unknown, and we're going to multiply it by 20%. Now this time I have all 100 here, so I don't actually need to divide by anything. This is all 100% of the grade. This is our score in the class, and we want to see at what point do we make a 70. Now here's where I told you it was a good idea to do what we had on the previous slide. Notice that this quantity right here is the same as my follow-up question quantity right here. So you can grab the same number that you had in your numerator. This number is 54.5. So I have 54.5 plus, let's write this as 0.2x. And that is equal to 70 for us to determine what grade is necessary to make a C in the class. Now let's just solve this equation. We will subtract 54.5 from both sides. That gives me 0.2x is equal to 15.5. Now, let's divide by 0.2 on both sides, and that gives me x is equal to 77.5. So to answer the question, let's round up with our grade. You need a 78 on the final to pass with a C. Let's do one more example with a different set of weights and some different scores. We want to know the current grade in the class and what we need in order to make a C in this particular class. This student has a 50 homework average, a 65 test average, and a 60 quiz average. It doesn't look like the student's been doing enough homework. Consequently, their quizzes haven't been great, their tests haven't been great. Let's see what their current grade is in the class, and then let's figure out what do they need to make in order to pass this class. Remember, take the grade, 50 for homework, times the weight, 0.15. Test average is a 65, and it's 60% for the tests. We have a 60 for the quiz average, and it's 15% for the quizzes. And this is not the whole thing. We don't have the final exam in the list, So let's add up the values that we did use, and then we will have a number to divide by that will skew the grade back to the regular scale. Without the final exam of 10%, we're really looking at 90% of the grade, and that's why we're dividing it out. Remember, it's a good idea to do the numerator separate. I get 55.5, and in the denominator I get 0.9 to get a current score of 61.67 in the course. Now the student needs to take the final exam. Let's use the same process of doing the grade times the weight plus the next grade times the next weight plus the next grade times the next weight. And remember, we want a final here this time. That's the unknown times its weight. And let me squeeze in a little 70 here. That's the score that we want. Now, just like last time, you already added up these three values. This is your 55.5. You've got a 0.1x, and we want that to equal 70. Let's subtract the 55.5 from both sides. We get 0.1x is equal to 14.5. Now divide by 0.1 on both sides, and we get x is equal to 145. No, we did not make a mistake. Because the student didn't do the homework, they didn't really do well enough. That 10% on the final exam, they need a lot of points to get up to passing. They need a 145 on the final exam out of 100 to pass the class. Needless to say, because the student didn't do enough work in the beginning, there is no way to help them at the end. The good news is that a lot of classes do have some other things, they're just a little bit harder to put in the average. In my particular class, you can replace old test scores with final exam scores to try to help you do better. We'll talk about that ourselves in class.